I drove from our place in Conata to my son-in-law's house in Rockcliffe Park that Sunday afternoon. And I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I am not a man who causes trouble. I spent 31 years as a labor relations officer for the federal government. I file my taxes early. I keep my lawn edged. I have never, not once in my life, raised my voice at a stranger. But when that man looked at me across his dining room table and said, "You really have no idea who you're dealing with, do you, old man?" something went very quiet inside me. Not angry quiet, decided quiet. The kind of quiet that means the conversation is over and the work is beginning. Let me back up. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's all she is to me. That's the only title that matters. Married Theodore Ashworth's son 3 years ago. The wedding was at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. 400 guests. Open bar until midnight. A string quartet during dinner. My wife and I sat at table 9, which I later learned was the table reserved for the other family's people, tucked near the kitchen entrance. I noticed, I said nothing. My son-in-law's name is Brendan. He's 34, works in private equity in the financial district in Toronto, and he is the kind of man who has never been told no in a way that actually stuck. His father, Theodore, everyone calls him Theo, though I never did, built a commercial real estate firm in the 90s, rode the Toronto condo boom like a wave, and came out of it with his name on 3 towers and a habit of treating waitstaff like furniture. Old money manners with new money arrogance. The worst combination there is. My daughter, Nora, is a speech-language pathologist. She works with children who have communication disorders at a clinic in the Glebe. She has more patience in her left hand than most people carry in their whole bodies. When she was 9 years old, she spent an entire summer teaching the neighbor's kid how to ride a bike, going out every evening after supper, running alongside him until her knees were scraped and he finally got it. That's who she is. That's who she has always been. She called me in February, about 14 months before any of this came to a head. It was a Thursday evening, late after 9. My wife was already in bed. Nora's voice was careful in a way that told me she had been rehearsing what to say. She told me things were difficult. She told me Brendan had a temper. She told me that his father, Theo, had started coming around more often since their son, my grandson Oliver, who was not yet 2 at the time, had been born, and that Theo had opinions about everything. How Nora was raising the baby, what she fed him, whether she was going back to work too soon, whether she was going back to work at all. She said Theo spoke to her like she was a problem he was managing, not a person he was speaking to. I asked her if she was safe. She paused for a moment too long before she said yes. I kept my voice steady. I asked what she needed from me. She said she didn't know yet. She said she just needed me to know. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My wife found me there when she came down for water around 11. She took one look at me and sat down, and I told her everything. She didn't say a word until I was finished. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to pay attention. I want to be honest about why I didn't drive to Toronto the next morning. I've asked myself that question many times since then. The answer is not a comfortable one. The answer is that I know how these situations work. I spent over 3 decades navigating disputes between people with power and people without it. I know that the father who shows up angry accomplishes nothing except giving the other side a reason to paint him as unstable. I know that evidence matters. I know that patience, applied correctly, is not weakness. It is the sharpest instrument available to someone who doesn't have money or lawyers on retainer. So I paid attention. I started driving to Toronto more often. Casual visits, Sunday lunches when Brendan was home, Saturday afternoons when he wasn't. I watched. I listened. I noticed that Nora's laugh had changed. It came a half-second later than it used to, like she was checking first whether it was safe to laugh. I noticed that she always knew where Brendan was in the house, the way you know where a car is in your blind spot on the highway. I noticed that Oliver, at 22 months, would go very still when Theo raised his voice. The dinner that changed everything was in April. A Sunday. Theo had declared it a family dinner, which in the Ashworth vocabulary meant that his preferences determined the menu, the timing, and the conversation topics. We arrived, my wife and I, to find Theo already seated at the head of the table, a position that technically belonged to Brendan, and Brendan sitting to his right like a junior associate at a client meeting. My wife and I sat across from each other. Nora was in the kitchen finishing something. Oliver was in his high chair beside her empty seat. The conversation was the usual performance. Theo talked about a development project in Mississauga. He talked about a politician he played golf with. He talked about private school options for Oliver, who was, again, not yet 2. He spoke about these things to Brendan, occasionally to my wife, never to me, except to ask me once whether I was enjoying my retirement. The word retirement, delivered in a tone that suggested it was a synonym for relevance. Nora came out of the kitchen carrying a serving dish. Theo said something to her. I didn't catch it. His voice was low, and she stopped walking. Whatever he said, it made her shoulders go up around her ears for just a moment. Then she set the dish down and went back to the kitchen. I excused myself a minute later, said I was going to use the washroom. Instead, I went to the kitchen. Nora was standing at the counter with both hands flat on the granite. She looked up when I came in and tried to smile. "What did he say to you?" I asked. She shook her head. "It's nothing, Dad. It's not nothing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He told me the potatoes are overdone, and that maybe if I spent less time at work and more time in the kitchen, things like that wouldn't happen." She paused. "I made the potatoes the way his wife used to make them. He told me that himself, 6 months ago." I stood there for a moment. I put my hand on her shoulder. I said, "Go sit down, I'll bring the rest." When I walked back into the dining room carrying the bread basket, Theo was in the middle of a sentence about Oliver. He was telling Brendan that the boy needed more structure, that Nora was too soft with him, that in his experience, and here he actually said, "in my experience," as though child-rearing were a portfolio he had managed. Children raised without firm boundaries became adults without direction. Nora had just sat down. She was reaching for Oliver's bib. She didn't respond to what Theo was saying. I watched her decide in real time not to respond. That calculation, the one where you weigh speaking against the cost of speaking, I recognized it. I had watched her make it too many times. I put the bread basket down and I said quietly, "I think Nora is doing a remarkable job with Oliver." The table went quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when someone has said something that disrupts the established order. Theo looked at me. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who has never found another man's opinion worth considering. "That's a father's bias," he said. "Understandable." "It's an observation," I said. "I've known her for 33 years. Theo set down his fork. "Look," he said, in the tone you use with someone you've decided not to bother arguing with. "No one's criticizing Nora. We're talking about what's best for Oliver. Different conversation." "Is it?" I said. Brendan said something then. I don't remember what, some attempt to smooth the air, and Theo talked over him without looking at him. Theo had redirected his attention to me now. I could feel it. "You know," he said, "I respect what you did. Your career, public sector, good pension, that's not nothing." The pause was precise and intentional. "But this family operates differently than you may be used to. The stakes are different." I looked at him. I didn't say anything. He took that as an invitation to continue. "Brendan's fund manages over $400 million in assets. The decisions we make, the decisions this family makes, they have weight. They have consequence. So when we talk about how Oliver is raised, we're not talking about potatoes." He leaned back slightly in his chair. The smile again. "I think you understand what I mean." "I understand exactly what you mean," I said. Then it happened. Nora reached across to adjust Oliver's tray, and as she pulled her arm back, Theo reached out. I don't know if it was reflex. I don't know if it was deliberate. I have thought about it many times. And he grabbed her wrist. Not hard, not for long, but he grabbed it and held it just for a moment and said, "Let him do it himself. You're always doing things for him." That's the problem. The table went quiet again. Different kind of quiet this time. Nora went still. Brendan looked at his plate. I stood up. Theo looked up at me, and the smile came back, smaller this time, more private. Sit down, he said. We're eating. We're done eating, I said. My wife's hand found my arm. I heard her say my name, just my name, softly. Sit down, Theo said again. I don't know what you think you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, I said. And so do you. We left 20 minutes later. I drove my wife to our hotel. We'd been staying at the Andes on Queen. I'd made the booking the week before, some instinct I couldn't have explained. And when she was inside, I sat in the car in the parking structure for a while. Not upset, not shaking. Still, I took out my phone and I made 2 calls. The first was to a woman I'd worked with for 11 years in the 90s. Her name doesn't matter. What matters is that she left the federal government in 2004 and spent the next 20 years building one of the most respected forensic accounting practices in Ontario. We had stayed in touch, not closely, but enough that when I called and explained the situation, she said, "Send me whatever you have and I'll tell you if there's anything worth looking at." The second call was to my son-in-law's fund's website. Not a call. I looked it up on my phone. I had the name of the fund from a Christmas card Brendan had sent 2 years ago, on firm letterhead. The kind of move that tells you everything you need to know about a man's relationship with his own ego. I wrote down the name of the fund and the registration number listed on their materials. Then I went inside, and I had a glass of water, and I went to sleep. The next 2 months were quiet from the outside. From the inside, they were the most focused period of my life since the 1997 transit strike negotiations, which is saying something. I drove to Toronto twice more. I had lunch with Nora alone each time, at a restaurant she chose, somewhere Brendan and Theo wouldn't happen by. She talked. I listened. I took notes in a small notebook when I got back to my car, not because I have a bad memory, but because I've learned that written records have a gravity that memory doesn't. My contact came back to me in early June. She had found something. Brendan's fund was registered with the Ontario Securities Commission. The registration was current and clean, but the fund structure, the way assets were being moved between a series of numbered holding companies, 3 of them registered in Alberta, 1 in Prince Edward Island, had a particular shape that she had seen before. Not illegal on its face, but the kind of architecture you build when you're planning for a specific kind of flexibility. The kind of flexibility that becomes relevant when, for example, a marriage ends and assets need to be located. She wasn't certain. She said so. But she said the pattern was consistent with what financial investigators call pre-divorce sheltering. She said if Nora ever needed a forensic audit to support a family property claim, the process would be long and expensive, and deliberately so. I sat with that for a week. Then I called a second person. A retired RCMP financial crimes investigator I had crossed paths with during a labor dispute involving a crown corporation in the early 2000s. We shared an elevator at the Chateau Laurier during a conference and ended up talking for 45 minutes in the lobby bar. I had his card still, in a shoebox in my study that my wife says is a fire hazard, and I say is an archive. I explained what my contact had found. I didn't overstate it. I presented it exactly as she had presented it to me. Uncertain, patterned, worth attention. He asked me 3 questions. Then he said, "I'm not active anymore, but I know who is. Let me make a call." 3 weeks later, Nora called me. She was trying to stay calm and not quite managing it. She said that 2 people from the OSC had come to Brendan's office that morning. She said Brendan had come home white-faced and wouldn't tell her what they'd said. She said Theo had called 4 times in the past 2 hours. I said, "Are you somewhere safe to talk?" She said yes. I told her to call a family lawyer that week. I told her the name of someone in Ottawa I trusted, who had practiced family law for over 20 years and who owed me a professional favor that I had never collected. I told her to do it quietly and to tell no one, not Brendan, not anyone in that family. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, what did you do?" I said, "I paid attention." She started crying then. Not the kind of crying that comes from sadness. The other kind, the kind that comes when something has been held in place by force for a long time and the force is released. I let her cry. I didn't say anything. Some things don't need words put around them. The next several months were not simple. I want to be honest about that. Legal proceedings, even the suggestion of legal proceedings, are not clean or fast or satisfying in the way that anyone who hasn't been through one imagines they will be. There were delays. There were conversations where Brendan attempted to reconcile. There were conversations where Theo's lawyer sent letters to Nora's lawyer that were, my contact told me, standard intimidation strategy, nothing more. But there was also this. The OSC investigation, once opened, found what my forensic accounting contact had suspected. Not everything, not all at once. These things move slowly and through channels I was not privy to and cannot speak to with precision. What I can tell you is that by September, Brendan had retained the criminal defense attorney. What I can tell you is that Theo's firm, which had co-signed 2 of the holding company registrations, was named in a civil proceeding that became public record in October. What I can tell you is that the man who told me to sit down, who grabbed my daughter's wrist at his own dinner table and told her she was the problem, spent a considerable portion of his autumn in meetings with lawyers and regulators, answering questions about transactions that had been designed specifically not to be answerable. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I want to be clear about that because I think it's important. I felt relief. There is a difference. Satisfaction is about the other person getting what they deserve. Relief is about the person you love being safe. I was not interested in Theodore Ashworth. I was interested in Nora. Nora and Oliver are in Ottawa now. They moved in November. She is renting a place in Westboro, a 10-minute drive from our house. Oliver is at a daycare near the parkway where the educators, Nora tells me, are extraordinary. He is talking more. He started saying Papa in December, which is what he calls me, and which I will not pretend did not require me to find something urgent to look at on the other side of the room. Brendan's situation is still working its way through the appropriate processes. I will not speculate about outcomes. That is not mine to determine. What I will tell you is this. I am 64 years old. I spent most of my adult life sitting across tables from people who believe that their position, their resources, their confidence, that any of those things made them powerful in some absolute and permanent way. And what I learned, across 31 years and more disputes than I can count, is that power is not a fixed thing. Power is what you are able to do when it matters. And what you are able to do depends almost entirely on what you have been paying attention to. Theodore Ashworth looked across that table and saw an old man from Kanata, with a government pension and a quiet manner. And he made a decision about what that meant. He decided it meant I was not worth calculating. That was his mistake. Not the only one he made, but the one that started everything else. I drove back from Westboro last Sunday. Nora had made dinner, roast chicken, roasted potatoes, the same ones she made that April evening that Theo said were overdone. They were perfect. Oliver ate approximately 4 pieces of chicken and 1 fistful of potato and then asked to get down and go play, which Nora allowed, because she is his mother and she knows him, and no one at that table had an opinion about it worth offering. After dinner, my wife and I sat with Nora on the back steps, while Oliver pulled up the last of the dead flower stalks in her little garden patch, very seriously, one at a time. The streetlights came on. The air had that cold, clean smell that Ottawa gets in late autumn, the one that I have always associated with things being finished properly at the right time. I didn't think about Theodore Ashworth once. Not once. I've been thinking about what Theodore actually believed that evening. Not what he said, what he believed. I think he genuinely believed that the distance between his life and mine was permanent, that the towers with his name on them in the fund with $400 million in it had placed him somewhere I could not reach. I think he looked at me and saw someone who had already finished, whose story was essentially over, and he made his decisions accordingly. That's the thing about a certain kind of arrogance. It doesn't just make you cruel. It makes you careless. And carelessness, over time, is what undoes people. Not dramatic mistakes. Not obvious villains caught in obvious lies. Just a slow accumulation of things left unguarded because the person who should have been watching them didn't think anyone else was paying attention. I was paying attention. I want to be careful here, because I don't think what happened to Theodore and Brendan was some kind of cosmic correction. I'm not comfortable with that framing. The world is full of men like Theodore who never face any consequences at all. And I know that. What happened in this case happened because specific people made specific decisions to look carefully at specific information. It was work. It was patience. It was knowing who to call and what to ask. But here is what I do believe. I believe that when you spend years treating people as though their lives are worth less than yours, less scrutiny, less consideration, less basic regard, you begin to make errors you cannot see. You leave things exposed that a more careful person would have protected. You say things at dinner tables that you would not say if you believed the other people at the table were capable of consequence. Theodore grabbed Nora's wrist in front of her father because he had already decided that her father did not matter. That decision was the crack in the wall. Everything else came through it. Nora is well. That is the only part of this I feel certain was right. Without qualification. She is in Westboro. Oliver is saying new words every week, and when I sit on our back steps in the evening, I am not thinking about the Ashworths at all. I'm thinking about the way Oliver pulls up dead stalks in the garden with that completely serious expression, like it is the most important work in the world, which for him, it is. I think the thing that has stayed with me most out of all of it is the conversation I had with Nora in the kitchen that April night. She was standing at the counter with both hands flat on the granite, and she said, "It's nothing, Dad." And I said, "It's not nothing." I have thought about that exchange many times since then, not because of anything dramatic about it. Because of how long she had been telling herself it was nothing, how long she had been doing that calculation, checking whether it was safe before she laughed, knowing where everyone was in the room. How much energy goes into surviving something quietly. I am 64 years old, and I know one thing with more certainty than almost anything else. Quiet survival costs more than people realize. And the people who demand that price from others, who rely on that silence, are always counting on no one coming to collect. I came to collect, quietly, patiently, with a notebook and 2 phone numbers, and 31 years of knowing exactly how these things work. That is enough. That has always been enough.